I love those words that we just prayed as we sang together. Um, and like Mark said, may times when we gather like this not be some compartmentalized and separated concept of gathering together, but that worship would be a component of everything that we do. And that everything in essence is a prayer crying out to God. And may we come with that kind of mindset and that kind of heart, so that literally we cry out, here's my heart, here's my heart, here's my life. Speak, God, whatever you want to speak into my life. And sometimes I think it'll be affirmation, and sometimes it'll be conviction, and both are good. Both are really good. All right, let's just dive in. We are in a series where we are talking through some things that is maybe a little different and may feel a little odd, but for me it makes sense because it's a personal journey for myself. This series is very personal to me. If you weren't with us last week, we started it off, and I shared probably a little more background into what this series is about. So I just invite you to get online, go listen to it. You'll hear it all, but it talks about the idea of what it's like to walk through a valley. And that as I speak to you from my heart in these things, it's not that I'm out of the valley yet, but I'm still going through it. And God's been speaking to my heart a lot through things I've read, through prayers, through the scriptures, through conversations. And I just want to share some of that with you, believing that, man, if I'm wrestling with some of this stuff, then maybe somebody else is too. And I had hoped in the midst of this valley that God was just going to give me some great clarity and some specific answers to things I was dealing with, but instead, He just gave me things to wrestle with. And the things He gave me to wrestle with are what we're talking about in these few weeks of what does it mean to be present? What does it mean to be content? And what does it mean to just be? And it's not some self-help talk that we're going to go through here. It's with the intent to think through these things as what does that mean as a follower of Jesus? For me, it's not even as a pastor responding to this. It is as a follower of Jesus, what does it mean to be present? What does it mean to be content? What does it mean to just be a follower of Jesus? And today, we're going to talk about contentment. Today, we're going to go down that road. And just to lay the foundation out right here at the beginning, I believe that the only way we're going to ever find true contentment is when you find contentment in Jesus. When you find that kind of contentment, man, it's going to be like this overflowing well that's going to be going into all the areas of your life, and everything that pops into your life, everything you think of, that contentment becomes a beautiful foundation. But I think the opposite of that, discontentment, when discontentment is there, man, when it's there, it becomes a poison in our life that begins to honestly pull us away from Jesus more than you would ever want to get dragged away. As we look at the scriptures today, we're going to look at some thoughts from Paul. We're going to look at some thoughts from David. So we'll be going into both the New and the Old Testament, but also going to learn some thoughts from somebody pretty special to me, my uncle. I want to show you a photo of he and I. This goes back just a few years. That's my Uncle Laverne. I know you think Laverne. I used to have fun with people. I'd go, and his wife's name's Lavelle, and I used to go, all right, which one of them's the man? And people would be stumped. But anyways, that's my Uncle Laverne. Thank you, Laverne and Shirley. And that's a cute little kid right there. He's cute. This is the only picture I could find of me and my uncle together, just the two of us, because we always be together at different family events. I want to give you another picture, another image of more recent photos that were taken of him. My uncle passed away back in 2014 in the month of January. He died from pulmonary fibrosis, which basically means it was a disease of the lungs, which would scar up your lungs, and it would cause problems with breathing, but also that scarring would lead to trouble with having oxygen in your blood. And he would eventually die from that disease. My uncle was an incredible man. He was a follower of Jesus. He was a husband, a father, a grandfather, a great-grandfather, a brother, and a pretty awesome uncle. He was a pastor. He was at one point in his life, he was a prison chaplain And he was the kind of guy who, when he would speak and when he would tell stories, you just got sucked in because he had he just had a knack for telling them and a certain element of wit that just brought you in. But he had that voice, that kind of voice that you could just sit and listen to for hours. He was my uncle. I miss him. And I look back and think back to talking about being present last week. If there's one regret I have is that I did not spend enough time with him in these later years of going, okay, I want to learn from your wisdom, from your experiences as a pastor. I want you to speak into my life. If I have a regret, it was not to be present more with him to ask those kind of questions. My uncle, in his last year of life, he would begin to journal. And I know he was journaling for himself, but honestly, I think he was journaling for the rest of us as family and friends. And he would use Facebook as his platform. And this is where he would go, and he would write different thoughts and share them. And part of what I'm going to share with you today are some of his thoughts, some of the things that he wrote down that he was sharing with everyone else about life. And I don't know when my uncle actually preached his last sermon, but he's going to be preaching to you today. And I hope you will listen with an open heart to what he may speak to you as his words hopefully point you and me closer to Jesus. Let me read to you an entry that he wrote back in 2013. He said these words. He said, "I've served 43 years as an active minister, but as a child, I wanted to be a national park ranger. The path I took was not a path I would have chosen. As a young minister, I daydreamed of being a superintendent. That would be like a pastor to pastors. And I ended up as a correctional chaplain. The path went in a direction far different than I would have planned it. And as a retiree, I planned a long, comfortable time of travel and health and volunteer work. It now looks like I might be on another path. The kinks and twists of life lead us in all ways we never expect, and both pleasant and unpleasant surprises await around the next turn. And most of us spend a lot of time wishing those back paths had led in a different direction." When I think about contentment, I think of the words of Paul that we're going to read in a few moments. I think of the words of David that we're going to take a look at. And I think of the life that was lived before me and my uncle. And I see and grasp better what contentment is. But as I'm going on that journey of trying to figure it out, and if God's telling me, listen, I want you to wrestle with what it means to be content as a follower of Jesus, I had to get personal with myself, and I had to go, okay, what are the things that's making it hard for me to be content in Jesus? What is it that's standing in the way? And for myself, I narrowed it down to a few things that you may be able to relate to, and maybe you won't, but at least hear my heart out. For me, I had to acknowledge that sometimes the reason I didn't find contentment in Jesus is because I was comparing, or I was waiting, or my issue was just plain and simply me, because I was turning to me instead of turning to Jesus. And as we look at some different scriptures today, I think we're going to be reminded that Jesus is enough, and you are not, and I am not. But as I look at these things and I think through, okay, this is what it was, or how I identified, these are things that make it hard for me to be content in my faith with Jesus. I also went to one of my uncle's journal things, and he was describing why it was so hard to live with pulmonary fibrosis. And here's his post. He says, "Little lessons Laverne learned lately." He likes the letter L. And you're going to hear a little bit of the wit and humor of my uncle in these thoughts as well. But he says, assistance chairs in the showers are convenient and very cold. He said it's easier to breathe in the car when the dash vent blows directly on one's face. And he said, to most people, the term pulmonary fibrosis in a conversation leads to a blank stare. This is one's my favorite. When dressing, always know where your oxygen tube is before putting on your pants. His last one, though, it fits so clearly with what we're talking about. He goes, a negative physical condition does not dictate a negative mental condition. In light of what we're talking about, circumstances do not dictate contentment. Your circumstances should not dictate contentment. We're going to be looking at these two different places in Scripture. I invite you to go ahead and turn to Philippians chapter 4. We're going to look there first, and then we're going to look at Psalms 37, okay? Philippians chapter 4, Psalms 37. We're going to read them both right now, and we'll come back to them as we work our way through the teaching this morning. But Philippians chapter 4, we're going to look at just a couple verses, start in verse 11. I'll give a little background. Paul is in prison, and he's speaking to some people who have been very generous and extending love and other things to him during this time. And so he extends not only gratitude, but wisdom as well with these words. Verse 11, chapter 4 of Philippians. I am not saying this because I'm in need, for I have learned to be content whatever the circumstances. I know what it is to be in need, and I know what it is to have plenty. And I've learned the secret of being content in any and every situation, whether well-fed or hungry, whether living in plenty or in want. I can do all this through him who gives me strength. Let's go back and look at David's words in Psalms 37. He's dealing with a group who has found themselves in captivity, and this psalm that he has put together is speaking into their lives because they're in captivity, and they are seeing all these people holding them captive, having success, living the life. Man, everything seems to be working out for them. And so there's a frustration that we are the ones worshiping the true God. Those people aren't even worshiping the true God. We are, and we're finding ourselves oppressed and in captivity. David writes these words in Psalms 37. Do not fret because of those who are evil, or be envious of those who do wrong, for like the grass, they will soon wither. Like green plants, they'll soon die away. Trust in the Lord and do good. Dwell in the land and enjoy safe pasture. Take delight in the Lord, and he will give you the desires of your heart. Commit your ways to the Lord. Trust in him, and he will do this. He will make the righteous reward shine like the dawn, your vindication like the noonday sun. Be still before the Lord and wait patiently for him. Do not fret when people succeed in their ways, when they carry out their wicked schemes. Refrain from anger and turn from wrath. Do not fret. It leads only to evil, for those who are evil will be destroyed. In both these scriptures, I think it gives us an idea of what it means to be content and how in the world do we live that out. And I shared with you the three areas that I have wrestled with that I know have held me back from being content, comparing and waiting and just me. But honestly, the one we're going to talk about first, comparing, is usually a result of where we're just not getting it right in the waiting, in being patient with God, when we're not getting it right and truly letting him have control and trusting him. And so we find ourselves comparing in many different ways. Now for me, I found myself comparing as I was walking through my valley. Part of my valley was a time where I was finishing up leading in a church and was trying to figure out what in the world the next steps were that God would have for us. And I would find myself have moments where we were interviewing in all these different places and talking to different churches or different these superintendents like my uncle had mentioned. And I would literally find myself, and I hate this, but I've got to admit it, that I would have moments where they would call and say, hey, we'd really like for you to consider, I'll call you back in a week to see what you're thinking. And I would have moments where I'd go, but man, God, if I go there, what if there's something better? And I hate that I had those thoughts. And I would have to work at capturing those thoughts and making them obedient to Christ, so I would walk through the process of being content way differently. But if we get real honest, one of the signs that things are heading in the wrong direction and us not being content is when we start comparing ourselves to others or to other circumstances. When we start comparing in a way that we are looking at what other people have, whether it's their money, maybe it's their job, maybe it's their marriage, maybe it's their spouse, maybe it's something that they own, material goods, maybe it's just how their life is being lived, and we start going, man, I want that. And we start comparing ourselves to them. If I just had this, if I just had that, man, if I had that kind of relationship, or man, if I just had this amount of money, then I would be content. If I just had those things, I'd be content. Let's look at Paul's words. Let's go to Philippians chapter 4 again. And in particular, we're going to look at verse 11. Because in verse 11, we see Paul acknowledging that he knows what it is to have a lot and to not have much at all. Look at verse 11. I am not saying this because I am in need, for I have learned to be content in whatever the circumstances. Then look at verse 12. I know what it is to be in need. I know what it is to have plenty. I have learned the secret of being content in any and every situation, whether well-fed or hungry, whether living in plenty or want. He knew what it was to be in plenty. He knew what it was to be in want. He knew what it was to probably want to compare to other people. And here's the dangerous thing, I think, for followers of Jesus, is that often we start thinking, well, I'm a follower of Jesus, so my life should be a little bit better than somebody that's not following Jesus. I know nobody wants to admit they've ever thought that, but maybe you have had that thought in your mind that if I'm following Jesus, then life should be a whole lot easier. Life should be different. But look at what Paul is saying. Paul, number one, is saying, hey, I know what it is to be in need. I know what it is to have want. I know what it is to live that way. But what does he do? He finds his contentment in Jesus. Paul understands hardships. He knows what it is to go through things. He knows what it is to have circumstances that rise up that he wasn't expecting. He knows what it is to see in others when he's hungry that they're not. And in this time, he's sitting in a prison cell. So you think about that for a moment. Paul, who wrote a lot of the letters that you read in the New Testament, this incredible apostle of God who is bringing this message of Jesus, who has had this incredible encounter with Jesus where he totally transformed his life, and now he's out there pointing people to Jesus. He is like the epitome of the apostle, man. He is there. He is a leader in the church. And yet, we see that God allows him to end up in prison. We see that there's times where he is literally have rocks thrown at him. He faces difficult circumstances. He's experiencing poverty. He's experiencing hunger. If God didn't give Paul a life of pony rides and rainbows, then why do you think that it's going to be any different for you? At least that's what I had to ask myself. I can't expect that everything in life is going to be perfect because I'm following Jesus. Because I don't find my identity in those things, I find my identity in Jesus. Therefore, I need to find my contentment in him. If you look at the Psalms, let's go back and look at David's words real quick. We're going to look at those first 4 verses just sort of briefly, but I want you to look at those words right there at the beginning. Do not fret because of those who are evil, or be what? Envious, comparing of those who do wrong. You read a little bit later, go ahead and look through. You'll see he talks about don't fret when people succeed in their ways. It's a reminder even from David, we can't allow ourselves to go there. God doesn't want you to have a life of jealousy and envy. That's not what he's hoping that we live. But if we start going into that realm, if we start going into the point of going, you know what, I am so discontent, and we start comparing ourselves to others and other circumstances and other things, or we start operating with a mindset that says, because I'm following Jesus, everything should be the pony rides and rainbows, and it's not. And so we start to look in these other avenues. And when we do that, I really think we're starting to dwell into a place where we're basically telling God, I don't trust you. God, I don't trust you, and what you have to offer is not good enough. It's not good enough. We struggle with comparison. Comparison is a sign that the evil has really come in, and it's taken us to a point where we're not turning towards Jesus. We're turning towards everything else. I also had to deal with this idea of waiting. The idea of waiting for me was the idea of being impatient. In the impatience that I had, I found myself at times waiting desperately for God to show up. And when God didn't show up, I think what I would do was I would start to take back control. In my impatience, I would get frustrated, and I'd be tempted to grab back control and take over. In our impatience, what do we want to do? We want to have things done our way. We want it done on our timing, and we want it done with our path. We want to tell what that looks like. But when you look back through Psalms 37, we get an idea that that's not what we're supposed to do. Look at those verses again, verses 7 to, let's just look at verse 7. Be still before the Lord and what? Wait patiently for him. Wait patiently for him. We have to look at that. Now, what does it mean to wait? Because often when we think of waiting, we think of doing nothing. I just got to sit here. I'm just going to sit here forever and wait for God to do something. But I think I think if you look at that psalm, again, I think you'll see that David gives us an idea of what waiting looks like. If you've got your Bible, I'm not going to read through it, but let me just point out some of the things that he described in this time of waiting. He said, don't fret. He said, hey, trust in the Lord. In the midst of your waiting, do good. Dwell in the land. That means you dwell in the circumstances, whatever it may be, you still acknowledge and go, okay, I'm going to trust God in the middle of this and enjoy the safe pasture. Enjoy the fact that as a follower of Christ, he's with you. You're not alone. Tells us in the midst of that waiting, take delight in the Lord. Commit your ways to the Lord. It also says, be still before the Lord in the midst of waiting. And it tells us that we should put our hope in him. Man, you read through that psalm and the definition and defining what it is to wait, that sure sounds like a lot to do. And I think the reason he calls us to that in the midst of waiting, so that we don't turn to discontentment, so that we don't turn to start comparing ourselves to everything else, is that in those moments, our faith would still be active. Even in those moments when we're trusting and delighting and committing our ways while we're waiting on God to show up, we're saying, God, I trust you. I trust you. How we respond in the waiting, how we respond in times where you really want to be impatient, but man, I've got to trust God in this, will say an awful lot to yourself and to others of what you really think about Jesus. In the waiting, those things are revealed. In the waiting, those things are seen. The last one that I mentioned was just me. I'm in the way. I am the one holding me back from being content. Self. I love a quote by Vernon McGee. This just messed with me in a good way. But he said, this is God's universe, and he does things his way. Now, you may have a better way of doing things, but you don't have a universe. And I was like, oh man, that's right. When we lack contentment in Jesus, we tend to be a little more self-centered. At least that's what I saw in myself. And when I say self-centered, it can be interesting because for me, that self-centeredness was not in me getting all arrogant and cocky. It was in me diving into insecurities. Not going, I'm so good, but in the middle of my valley going, man, maybe I'm not really that good. And when those insecurities got a hold of me, I turned back to self for the answers. I turned to myself to try to get through. Because in those times when we turn to self, it's often where we will take over and take control, like we did with waiting. We take control of this. And what do we want? We want to redefine contentment. We want to define contentment as being all my expectations are being met, all my needs are being taken care of, and all my frustrations are gone. Well, remember what we just said about Paul. It didn't work out that way for him, so we shouldn't expect it to work out that way for us. So we can't operate with that kind of a mindset when it comes to the idea of being content. We can't allow it to twist our desires and understanding of what contentment is really all about. Going back to the psalm, looking at Psalm 37, verses 5 and 6, he says this. He says, commit your ways to the Lord, trust in him, and he will do this. And then he goes on to describe with poetic words of saying God's going to show up, is basically what he says in verse 6. But the first part of verse 5 matters because it says, commit your ways to the Lord. When you go back to the original language, when you go back and take a look at what it really says, it says this. It says, roll your ways on the Lord. That sounds really weird to me because it is weird. But to those in the context who would understand this, the people he was speaking to in that time, the language that's used there is more the idea of loading up a camel. A camel would come and the camel would lay down and they would load everything onto the camel and the camel would then carry the load. He would do the work for you. He would, in essence, be caring for you. So he's telling us when you're so tempted to compare, when you're tempted to act in your impatience, when you are getting self-centered in the midst of this, you need to take those frustrations and you put them on Jesus. You need to take your expectations and put them on Jesus. The things that you need, put that on Jesus and go, God, I just trust you. I give everything I have. I just trust you. I'm going to put my load, I'm going to quit trying to carry this around, and I'm just going to put it on you because I want to find my contentment in you. I really believe that contentment is a choice. It is a choice to embrace that God is doing something in your life. It is a choice to trust Him. It is a choice to believe that He cares. It's a choice to believe that God is still at work in your life, that God is going to bring good to those that love Him out of some of the ugliest things. Now, one side note, you don't get to define what the good is. That's up to God. But you got to choose to believe these things. Go back to Philippians one more time, and we look at Philippians, and when we see those words that he spoke in verse 11, I'm not saying this because I'm a need, but he's given the answer right here. For I have learned to be content, whatever the circumstance. Paul is sitting in jail telling us he has learned to be content right where I am, trusting God, right in the middle of where I'm at. Not trying to dream of something being different, but just trusting God in the midst of the circumstances I find myself in right now. Whatever God decides to do, whatever God decides not to do, I'm content. In the middle of those moments, we've got to look for the ways that we can see that God is at work in the midst of being content in Him. I want to read to you another statement, thoughts from my uncle. And I wish you could hear his voice as I do as I read this to you. But he posted these thoughts. He said, Ronald Reagan's favorite joke was about a little boy who was having trouble and so was put in a barn full of horse manure. The psychologist who put him there was thinking that he would melt down into tears or a tantrum. Instead, he climbed up on the top of the stinky mess and he started digging, saying, with all this manure, there has got to be a pony in here somewhere. My uncle would write these words after that. He said, right now, after seeing a cardiologist today and going through another session of pulmonary rehab, I feel like I am atop that same pile of manure, and I'm having a difficult time trying to dig through it to find the pony. Yet my faith tells me that there is a pony somewhere in this disease that lives in me. Well, I have to admit that I have found a few encouraging signs in the pile already. I've been reunited via Facebook and word of mouth with old college friends and associates and acquaintances from years gone by, and I've found a host of new friends who understand what I'm dealing with now. I've had a renewal of my faith in an ever-loving God and everlasting life, and I've grown much, much closer to my family. Yes, I am getting glimpses of the pony. I've returned to the Psalms for my daily scripture reading, and I find that they are speaking more directly to my heart than they ever have before. Psalms 114:8 says, He turned the rock into a pool of water, yes, a spring of water flowing from a solid rock. Water out of a solid rock. Suppose Moses thought something like, with all this rock, there's got to be a spring here somewhere. Nah, probably not. But if that flinty rock wall held a life-giving hidden spring of water, there must be something like that in this solid wall that looms ahead of me. So if the manure means a pony and if the solid rock means a spring somewhere, I need to look for the hidden values of that pile of manure and the impenetrable rock that I face. We are given the answer to where we can discover the power that's going to enable you to see and find the value in the circumstances you're walking through that would normally draw you to be impatient with God, that would normally draw you to focus in on self, or would have you start to compare yourself to others. The power that can help you live in the contentment so you don't go down those paths is found in what Paul wrote in Ephesians chapter 4. We've already read it 3 times, but let's look at it one more time because he gives the answer. Look at verse 12 and 13. He says, I know what it is to have plenty. I've learned the secret of being content in any and every situation, where well-fed or hungry, whether living in plenty or in want. I can do all this, or all things, depending on the version you have, through Him who gives me strength. You're not going to find contentment until you discover the power that is made available to you in Jesus. Think about it. He's saying you can be content through the strength of Jesus. It is within you. It is there and it is available to you even now in this life. A couple weeks ago, you sat around a Christmas tree, and if you got kids, they were ripping open packages left and right. As a good uncle, one of the best gifts that I love to give out was, well, it really wasn't for my nieces and nephews. It was a gift to my brothers and my sisters. I loved giving gifts that had 1,000 pieces. Merry Christmas. Or my personal favorite are the ones that would light up and sing songs. You know what I'm talking about. All the bright lights blinking and that blaring, annoying music comes across, and it's like Mary Had a Little Lamb, and it repeats 5 times, and you can't turn it off. I love giving those gifts. Those gifts were lifeless without putting the batteries in. So what would I do? Second package would be a package of lifetime of batteries for that toy. We made sure that they were going to hear that. When it comes to contentment, you already have the batteries in you. If you're a follower of Jesus, Christ lives within you. It's a great mystery of the gospel. He's there. The Holy Spirit is there to guide you and lead you and direct you. He is within you. So if the power is there, why are you not using that power? That's the question I had to ask myself. If true contentment could be found, it's this beautiful blend of God's power and of my choice to respond to that. The power comes from God, and I have to use it. So to make it practical, you know what the Holy Spirit has been doing and leading in my life? He's been reminding me in times when I'm being impatient. He just speaks into my heart and mind, hey, trust God. Just trust. And in times where I've found myself relying on self and wanting to take control and wanting to just step in and take over, the Holy Spirit speaks to me and just saying, hey, Jesus is enough. You don't have to grab back control. Jesus is enough. And in times when the temptation is there to compare myself in any stinking way, I capture those thoughts. I make them obedient to Christ because through Christ, through His strength, I can find contentment. I want to read one more post to you from my uncle. And it's actually finishing out the post I started at the beginning. And he says these words. You'll recognize some of them because I just read them. But he said, the kinks and the twists of life lead us in all ways that we never expect. And both pleasant and unpleasant surprises await around the next turn. And most of us spend a lot of time wishing those back paths had led in another direction. A year ago, I had open heart surgery, and I asked my maker for a successful surgery. And he didn't promise that, but he did assure me almost audibly that whatever the result was, good or otherwise, he would be with me, giving me the grace to deal with it. And that made that experience meaningful, and that is what he has done. Believe me, he goes, I didn't choose to have pulmonary fibrosis. I had not even heard of it. It was a pathway I did not know existed, and now I am ambling down it at a leisure pace, learning of a life experience I never dreamed would be mine. I can't say I'm having fun or enjoying the experience, but the leading presence of the Almighty is making it endurable. And yes, enjoyable. I'd rather have Jesus. And he doesn't end that with a period. It's ... because he's referencing an old hymn of the church that says these words. It says, I'd rather have Jesus than silver or gold. I'd rather be his than have riches untold. I'd rather have Jesus than houses or land. I'd rather be led by his nail-pierced hands than to be a king of a vast domain or to be held in sin's dread sway. I'd rather have Jesus than anything this world affords today. I'd rather have Jesus than men's applause. I'd rather be faithful to his dear cause. I'd rather have Jesus than worldwide fame. I'd rather be true to his holy name. He's fairer than the lilies of the rarest bloom. He's sweeter than the honey from out of the comb. He's all that my hungering spirit needs. I'd rather have Jesus and let him lead.